Welcome to The Fine Print, a podcast where experts at Succession Resource Group unpack the latest industry trends, recommendations, and observations for independent advisors managing their practice, with no fluff and hopefully a little entertainment. In each episode, we'll discuss ways in which you can understand and leverage the value of your business, grow your business through M&A, but also through an optimized organizational structure. Improve and protect your business to create a sustainable enterprise that can hopefully outlast you. And lastly, preparing for your eventual retirement and how to maximize that result. We're not just tackling high-level concepts, hence the title. We're getting into the details, or the fine print. So, we encourage you to listen in with whatever beverage suits your preference, and let's get to the forefront of industry trends with a fresh perspective to help you achieve your long-term business goals.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Fine Print. My name is Todd Folks. I am General Counsel for Succession Resource Group. Normally, David Grau does these episodes, but we decided to give him the day off today. Plus, I have a special guest who I will introduce in just a moment. Today, we're going to talk about something old, something new, actually one and the same. It's old because the origins are from literally the 1940 Act. And it's new because it's something that's surprisingly come up recently with some SEC sweeps regarding RIAs that are doing M&A transactions. And what we're going to talk about particularly today is something called the endorsement provision under the marketing rule. So what we'll discuss is basically what's going on, why it's going on, and what you can do to protect yourself. Luckily today, I have my special guest, Christine Schleppegrell. Christine is an attorney with Morgan Lewis in Washington, D.C. She's also formerly an attorney with the SEC and had a hand in writing the regulations that we're talking about today. So we're very, very happy to have her as a special guest. So Christine, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, your past, that would explain to us where you are now in your career?
Absolutely. So I would say one pivotal part about my professional past is the opportunity to work at the SEC as a branch chief in the Division of Investment Management and to work on a lot of exciting rulemakings, including the marketing rule, and the opportunity to examine advisors and have that experience and see what it's like to be on the other side of the table and bring that back to private practice and help counsel clients through that process as they register, as they start to grow their business. So that's one fun fact that I think that aspect of working at the SEC and then being able to bring that back, that will help explain where I am today.
Christine, I can tell you for sure that SRG, our clients, and I'm sure your clients, are very happy that you came back from the dark side.
Well, thank you.
I'd like to start from a very high level, talking about what the marketing rule is, and then we'll get down into the details and actually share some examples, and most importantly, share some solutions with you that Succession Resource Group will have for you. So the first question is, what is the marketing rule? Well, if you're an RIA, especially if you're an RIA under the SEC, you know what it is. It's basically the standards by which an advisor communicates, markets, and advertises. It's the rule under which you're able to do that. I mentioned this is old and new. It's old because its origins were in the 1940 Act, but it's been iterated over time as any law, any regulation is. So in 2022, the SEC revamped the marketing rule. And what we're specifically talking about today is how it revamped the marketing rule to include endorsements. So this has never been permitted before. Testimonials or endorsements under the SEC rules. And I've always joked with my business owner friends and colleagues that are not in our industry that testimonials and endorsements are really something that they should be using. They're incredibly powerful. And the reason why it was a joke was because I would always explain that they're so powerful that the SEC, our industry, actually bans them. So that's not the case anymore, which is great. But there are very particular rules and requirements that you have to follow in order to be compliant with this new rule. So how does this rule, a marketing rule, apply to M&A transactions? A few regional SEC offices have begun to interpret the marketing rule and the endorsement provision of it to apply to M&A transactions where a seller is promoting a buyer to the seller's clients. Now, anyone who's done an M&A transaction in this space or otherwise knows that one of the pieces to the puzzle after closing, maybe the most important piece, is that a seller is going to champion a buyer or buyers, that person or firm, to their clients. Remember, the financial remuneration that they receive in the transaction is almost invariably, inextricably intertwined with the success of those clients moving to the buyer. So it's part and parcel of almost any M&A transaction that we see. And obviously you can't pick up a trade publication these days without seeing something about an M&A transaction. So we see a lot of M&A activity recently. So what we want to do is really cover how this marketing rule, and more specifically the endorsement provision of the marketing rule, applies to M&A transactions. So let's start by talking about what's happening. We were really happy about having Christine on this podcast because she does this. She works with RIAs on a regular basis. And I think, Christine, actively, you're helping people with this particular issue, correct?
That's right. We're helping folks think about, both buy side and sell side firms, think about what does this suite mean for the M&A deal we're currently working on or the one that we're contemplating. And I do work with investment advisors to provide regulatory support as they go through the M&A transaction. And of course, we have folks at Morgan Lewis who handle the transactional details of the merger or the acquisition. And so it's a very key part, especially given the SEC's focus on this for SEC registered investment advisors when they are the purchaser, when an SEC registered investment advisor is the purchaser entity.
Some of the questions that we've gotten really they surround who is, for lack of a better term, who's getting in trouble? Who is the SEC focusing on here? So back to my fact pattern, Christine, if I'm buying your RIA and we put a deal together, I give you billions and billions of dollars because that's how much I really want this business. And that's what your value is, billions and billions of dollars. So we put the transaction together, and then you begin to communicate to your clients about how great of a firm Todd has. And you are encouraging folks to move over to Todd's firm. So basically what's happening is the SEC is looking at this with the lens of, this looks like an endorsement because Christine is promoting my firm, encouraging her clients to move to my firm. And so that's where the auspices of this new provision, somewhat new, 2022, and the interpretation more recently, towards the end of last year and this year, Christine, is when it's been happening. So basically, the SEC is looking at me as the buyer and basically saying that I am paying Christine to endorse me, to promote me, to market me to her clients. So that's really the auspices of where this is all coming from. Christine, do you want to dig that a little bit deeper?
Sure, absolutely. So under the marketing rule, an endorsement is defined to include any statement of support about the advisor. Now, that is very broad, right? Any statement of support about the advisor. So when we have a situation using Todd's example, where Todd is an SEC registered investment advisor, let's pretend for purposes of this hypothetical, and the SEC is alleging, I'll call it an alleged endorsement, right? Because we're not conceding it's an endorsement, but the SEC is saying, we believe this is an endorsement because you have the sell side advisor making compensated statements of support about the purchaser advisor. And therefore, it meets the definition of an endorsement under the marketing rule, which is a compensated statement of support about the SEC registered investment advisor. So that is the theory of the case that the SEC examiners are advancing.
Yeah, and when I first heard about this, my knee-jerk reaction was that it really didn't make any sense at all. I slept on it, and as I begun to think about it a little bit more, there are various pieces that I wholeheartedly disagree with. However, I see how you can make that connection, how you can connect the dots and relate this to the marketing rule, and more specifically, the endorsement provision. So I think one of the great things about what we're talking about today, number one, is I mentioned that it's only the SEC, right, Christine? This is not something that state regulators or that state RIAs are under. They don't fall under the SEC marketing rule or this endorsement provision, correct?
That's right. So the SEC marketing rule only applies to SEC registered investment advisors. And fun story, when I was at the SEC and the marketing rule had just become final, we had state registered advisors call in and ask, can we comply with the marketing rule? We're so excited. We saw the new rule provides a lot of certainty in how we state registered advisors can communicate with our prospective clients and investors. Can we follow this rule because we like the certainty? And the answer, unfortunately, was no. If you're not an SEC registered investment advisor and you are instead state registered, you are required to follow your state's marketing rule or whatever provisions would govern communications with prospective clients and investors. So it is really, we're looking at situations for purposes of this M&A theory. For the exam sweep, we're looking at situations where the purchaser is SEC registered and therefore subject to the marketing rule.
I think it also bears noting that there have only been a couple of offices, I think Miami and Fort Worth, that I'm aware of that I've verified that have done this. Now, that's not to say that it's not going to become more widespread. It could. Let's assume that it does, because what we want to do for our clients at SRG is make sure that you're protected and you have solutions. Obviously, we can't give you legal advice here, but we can definitely help out with some solutions here because, again, we're in the business, and this is something that was new to me. It was surprising, quite frankly, to me. So your local attorney may probably not really know about this or even understand it. So we're here to help you through this process, and this will become a part of our entire workflow on the deals that we do, is working with buyers and sellers, bringing this to light to make sure they understand and are aware of it where it's applicable, and helping them with solutions, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the podcast about what those solutions are. So Christine, you and I talked a little bit yesterday about why we think this is happening. I will let you answer first because I think my answer is a little bit more cynical.
So we know that the SEC exam staff has been excited about using its new tool in the toolbox, which is the marketing rule, since the compliance date, which is in November of 2022. We've seen several sweeps on the marketing rule since the implementation date. So we've seen sweeps on hypothetical performance. We've seen more recent sweeps on testimonials, endorsements, and third-party ratings. And so it doesn't come as a surprise that the SEC exam staff is very focused on applying this rule and making sure that advisors comply. So I think that is also part of what's underlying the sweep, is that this is a tool in their toolbox and they're looking at new and novel ways to apply the endorsement provisions of the marketing rule.
The other thing that you and I were talking about yesterday is other sweeps that we've seen. And I had talked about like the cash sweep. It sounds like a double positive or maybe a double negative. Basically what that was a few years ago, what firms would do basically is they would have investments, hold investments for their clients, and some of those investments were cash accounts. So what the firms would do, and still do, it's not prohibited, is that they would take their clients' cash and loan that out on a short-term basis and then get a better rate of return than their clients were getting. So I'm just going to make up some numbers here. Let's say a client gets a 1% return in a cash account. A firm may loan that cash out on a short-term note to another firm, another bank, or something of that nature, and then maybe they get a 3% return. So the delta, that 2%, they get to keep. So what the SEC said is, number one, it's not prohibited, but you're a fiduciary, so you need to make sure that it's equalized. So basically, it has to be fair to the client. So you taking 2% and you giving them 1% didn't seem fair. So there were a number of large firms who got in some trouble for doing that because the spread, that delta, the SEC thought was just too large. So that was one of the ones that I had talked to Christine about yesterday. But Christine, you had another example, one that I thought was very pertinent to this discussion.
And a few of the other examples we've seen sweeps on are hypothetical performance. So the SEC has done 2 sweeps on hypothetical performance under the marketing rule. Hypothetical performance is defined under the marketing rule, and it includes performance that was not actually achieved by the advisor that is showing the performance. So hypothetical performance is a type of performance that is governed by the marketing rule, and the SEC did a sweep in September of 2023 and then April of 2024, focusing on advisors that had failed to comply with these parts of the marketing rule. In addition, another marketing rule sweep, more recent, in September of 2024, the SEC did a sweep on testimonials, endorsements, and third-party ratings. That sweep is, of course, more pertinent to what we're talking about today, which is alleged endorsements in the context of an M&A transaction.
Again, Christine and I were talking about this yesterday just to kind of lend some perspective. And I don't want to downplay what's happening right now with the SEC, with the endorsement rule and its application to M&A transactions. It's just not, at this point, as large and widespread as the sweeps that Christine and I just talked about briefly. We'll see what happens in the future, but I think most importantly is for us to be able to get out in front of this and make sure our clients are taken care of. I don't think this is a profound change in what we're doing in our industry. I truly think that this is a situation where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that's why we are so emphatic about getting solutions to our clients to make sure that they're protected. I think that both this podcast and also the materials that we'll have after this podcast will be very informative, helpful, and quite frankly, I don't think you'll be able to find it anywhere else, at least not now. So Christine, let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening when someone gets looked at for this. So what are the types of questions when an examiner comes into a firm's office, an RIA's office? What types of questions, what types of things are they looking for with this sweep?
I'll mention that we've seen the sweep come out in a couple different forms. So we've seen the sweep come out as a standalone list of questions that are only focused on these alleged endorsement issues. And then we've also seen the sweep come out in a situation where it's part of a larger request list, where the examination staff is looking at other things. Maybe it's a standard request list, and there are a few questions on this topic. It's not the SEC's inquiry is not solely about this issue. But to answer your question, Todd, some of the questions that are on the request list are whether any of the seller's clients refused to move over to the buyer, whether there were any holdouts, basically. Another is a copy of the purchase agreement. So the SEC is interested in looking at the terms of the deal. They've also asked for a summary of the transaction and a list of any other similar transactions that occurred during the examination period. Now, usually an examination period lasts for 1 to 2 years, so it is not a tremendously long look-back period. And in other cases, they've asked for copies of communications to the seller's clients related to client account transfer, so moving accounts over to the purchaser. So again, going back to your point, Todd, where it's about the communications to the seller's clients, and that remains a focal point.
Got it. So let's shift gears here a little bit. We've kind of talked about the what, we've talked about the why a little bit, but let's talk about what's happening when someone does get an interview for something like this. So we haven't seen any enforcement actions so far. What we're seeing are deficiency letters. So that's been one of the questions that our clients have been asking is, what's happening? What kind of trouble can I get in? Well, so far it's just been a deficiency letter, and it's been a deficiency letter to the buyer. So the next question is, what is a deficiency letter? Well, very specifically, it's not an enforcement action. Like Christine was just talking about, an examiner will come in and ask a lot of questions, ask for a lot of documents, and I use the term a lot that it's not that you're in trouble. You have to answer some questions and produce some documents, but it definitely is a time vampire. It will take a lot of your time to do this. Again, goes back to my point of an ounce of prevention. If you're able to produce documents and answer the questions easily, then this shouldn't be a problem. I'm not aware of any fines that have been levied in this area. Christine, have you heard of any fines that have been levied for this?
No, and it might be worth pointing out here that there are two different divisions at the SEC that handle examinations, which is what we're talking about right now with the sweep, and then separately enforcement. And that is where the enforcement actions that can result from a sweep can come out. So those are two different divisions of the SEC. What we're focused on today is the former, which is the Division of Examinations coming in and asking some questions. And that is very different than the folks that would bring an enforcement action that could result in civil monetary penalties, and other issues could come up, but those are bifurcated processes, basically.
Okay. So let's move a little bit further along in the chronology, and talk about what RIAs can do to protect themselves here. This is going to shock everyone. Disclosures. So being able to show that you have appropriate disclosures under the marketing rule, which again, the application, Christine and I are both still shaking our heads, scratching our heads a little bit on the stretch that the SEC is making here. But I do understand to a certain extent how they can connect the dots here. But it's really just a matter of making sure you have the proper disclosures on those communications, obviously not making anything in those communications so radical that it's going to raise the eyebrow of the regulator in the first place, right? So they need to be true, they need to be correct, they need to be accurate. But having those disclosures is something that the SEC is looking for. Christine, under the marketing rule and under the endorsement provision in particular, what are some of and there's only a handful, less than a handful, what are the most important disclosures that really an RIA needs to make in these communications?
And just to take a step back here, I think what we're encouraging folks to think about is just be mindful of the SEC's alleged endorsement theory. We're not suggesting that every communication is going to be an endorsement, or that folks comply with the marketing rule disclosure obligations and treat these communications as endorsements. Not at all. So it's really just to raise awareness about this theory. It is not a suggestion to capitulate to the SEC's theory that these types of communications are in fact endorsements, because there is some skepticism there. And I don't think this was really the intended purpose of this part of the marketing rule. So I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that it's to think about, okay, how could the SEC view these communications, and just be mindful of the issues that it could raise. By no means is it a suggestion to go ahead and wholesale apply the marketing rule to your communications. But what might help us think about what we should be mindful of when we're reviewing voluminous disclosure is to think about what is the SEC saying in deficiency letters in connection with this sweep. What is it that they're taking issue with? And one of the things is that the alleged endorsement is not accompanied by appropriate disclosure about the seller's conflict. Basically saying, well, the seller should have explained that it is incentivized to say good things about the purchaser because the seller wants to get paid by the purchaser in connection with this M&A deal. And while that may seem very obvious to most people and probably the clients who are reading those communications, the SEC is taking issue with that in deficiency letters. In addition, the SEC is taking issue with the lack of compensation disclosure. So to Todd's point, under the marketing rule, part of complying with the endorsement provisions is to disclose conflicts of interest and any compensation that was received in exchange for what we're calling the alleged endorsement in this conversation. And so the SEC is saying, well, you didn't disclose the conflicts, and then you also didn't disclose compensation that was received in connection with the transaction. So those are really what we're seeing stated in deficiency letters.
Christine, I love how you broke that down. And I would kind of come in and add a little bit to that. I haven't seen anything, and hopefully this never happens. I think this is where I would end up having to dig my heels in, is disclosing the actual compensation of a deal. Everything that I've looked at so far, everything that I've heard is just that the fact that there could be compensation paid to the person who is endorsing the RIA, but I haven't seen anything that says you have to disclose what that compensation is. One of the other things, the related things that I'd like to talk about today really is the 2026 exam priorities and how this endorsement provision of the marketing rule fits into it.
Absolutely. And it's important to think about what we know is happening with this sweep, but also think about other statements of the SEC and the staff that align with the developments we're seeing in the market when we hear more and more about this development. And one is the 2026 exam priorities, which recently came out. And there is some language in there where it explicitly says the Division of Examinations is going to focus on particular types of advisors and services and other types of activities and business practices that result in potential or actual conflicts of interest. The priorities go through a few examples, and one of them is advisors that have merged or consolidated with or been acquired by existing advisory practices, and how that could result in operational or compliance complexities or new conflicts of interest. And while that doesn't exactly scream SEC M&A marketing rule sweep on its face, it is related to the development that we're talking about today. So it is interesting to see how the 2026 exam priorities do align with this M&A sweep development.
It'll be interesting to see if these sweeps expand past the regional offices that we've seen so far and what application they may have to state registered RIAs, or this theory of alleged endorsement. By the way, I'm going to steal that and I'll give you credit for it, but alleged endorsements, it's a great term. I would say to distill this down to its essence, this provision of the marketing rule, the most important thing that we see for our clients, our RIAs, is just to be, number one, aware. Number two, to have in hand the disclosures that we think are appropriate for this situation and that we think will keep you out of hot water, or at least help you stay out of hot water. And again, when you're on a podcast with two attorneys, you're never going to hear the G word. The other thing that we'll tell you is that there's no such thing as anything being bulletproof, but we want to put our clients in the best situation to be able to help protect themselves. And we don't want to be defensive here. We want to be aware, because we want to make sure that our transactions, the deals that we do, the M&A transactions, continue to be very, very successful.
And to distill it down, I think the takeaway is to keep your fingers on the pulse of this development and just be mindful of these theories that the exam staff is advancing.
Thank you, everybody, for joining the podcast today. We will continue to keep you posted on any developments that we see here, that we hear about here. And we will have some materials for you that we'll produce as far as a playbook, FAQs, a white paper, something of that nature. But again, one of the most important things that I think that will be in that packet, other than an overview and a description of what the SEC is looking at here, will be the disclosures that we think are going to be appropriate, that have been vetted, that you'll have access to, and that you can use to put those together, those communications together. And it will be part and parcel of our entire workflow on the deals that we do here at SRG. So thank you very much for your time. And maybe next time we won't give David Grau the day off.
And that concludes another episode of The Fine Print from SRG. We hope you found this episode both interesting and valuable. We encourage you to check out our website at www.successionresource.com. And of course, connect with us on social media for the latest happenings here at SRG. If you just can't get enough of The Fine Print, we invite you to join our monthly webinar series and newsletters where we address many of the topics covered in this podcast in greater detail. Finally, if you enjoyed today's episode as much as we did recording it, please leave us a review, a good one, mind you, and tell your industry friends about us. Your support helps us continue to bring you the best content possible. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests or individual hosts and not necessarily the views or opinions of Succession Resource Group. Content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, as amazing it might be. Always seek the advice of an expert with any questions you may have. As always, we at SRG stand ready to help when you're ready.